Thank you. It's wonderful to join you all, even if it is from very far away. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation to be able to share my work today. I do want to preface my presentation by saying that this is a different kind of paper than what I usually write because it's heavily focused on secondary literature. So the aim of the paper is to provide a critical survey of the ways Watsuji's philosophy has been taken up within discussions of contemporary environmental ethics. But in addition to a kind of survey of the literature, I do offer my own thesis on what I understand the major contribution of his work to be, as it is relevant to these discussions. So, having said that, I will go ahead and share my screen so you all can read. Okay, so much has been said about Watsuji's original ethical framework developed from the standpoint of Ningen Sonzai, which emphasizes the fundamental relationality of spatial betweenness, Heidegger. His notion of fudo, or climatic milieu, has also garnered much discussion for its recognition of the environmental dimensions of the spatiality of human existence. However, less work has been done to integrate these ideas into discussions of contemporary environmental ethics. The work that has been done on this subject has come to a range of conclusions. For example, John Moraldo remarks in passing that Watsuji's ethics can be criticized for being yet another anthropocentric or human-centered theory. Others interpret Watsuji's philosophy of Fudo as a new contribution to environmental ethics, one that recognizes the interrelatedness of human and ecological life. Yet, even among these commentators, the real force of Watsuji's ideas as they relate to environmental ethics remains unclear. Their discussions point to some possible avenues to explore, but more needs to be done to articulate what normative claims might be derived from Watsuji's ethics and philosophy of Fudo when applied to contemporary environmental issues such as climate change and biodiversity loss. My goal here is to do just that. I argue that the spatiality of Ningen Sonzai and the experience of Heidegger allow for the mutual expressivity of individuals and the climatic milieu of which they are part. When we consider the reciprocity involved in expressive action, especially within the context of Watsuji's writings on aesthetics, the responsiveness of individuals to one another within a milieu implies a sensitivity and attentiveness. That mode of engagement can be extended to the ecological elements of one's milieu as well as other persons. This comportment, in turn, can lead to more ecologically sound ways of life. So in the first part of the paper, I will compare and analyze the handful of attempts that have been made in English to situate Watsuji's philosophy within the discourses of contemporary environmental ethics. And then in the second part, I will outline my own account of how aspects of Watsuji's philosophy can be leveraged to respond to present ecological issues. So part one. Watsuji is well known for his work in ethics, which is grounded on his understandings of ningen, or human being. According to Watsuji, human being has a dual structure, being both individual and communal simultaneously. Central to his conception of human being, and therefore his ethics, is the notion of betweenness, Heidegger, which refers to the shared cultural space of human interaction. Conceived in concrete terms, this space must be understood as situated in an earthly place, structured by social institutions and infrastructures, which is expressed in his concept of Fudo. Scholars have thoroughly demonstrated the influence of Heidegger on Watsuji, noting that Watsuji's time spent studying and traveling in Europe spurred him to reflect more deeply on the unique qualities of Japanese thought. One such quality is the recognition of the spatial relationality of human being. Watsuji perceived Heidegger's account of Dasein to overemphasize the temporal nature of human existence at the expense of its spatiality. For Watsuji, this was a significant limitation, since the sharing of space bespeaks for him the relation of betweenness, central to what it means to be human. Watsuji critiqued Heidegger's emphasis on the temporality of human existence because the temporal structure of Dasein is tied to its individual being towards death. Thus, Watsuji believed Heidegger failed to give an adequate account of Dasein's inherent relationality. Dilworth explains, according to Watsuji, Heidegger ultimately lost sight of the spatial and social side of human existence in the second half of Sein und Zeit. when he stressed the radical temporality of Dasein's being towards death. In the individual's experience, Sein is existence for death, but from the perspective of the whole of society, while individuals die, mankind lives, and man's world continues. In other words, what is being towards death from an individual's view is being towards life from society's point of view. William Lafleur notes that Watsuji observed that even though Western thought in general had no difficulty seeing that time is intimately tied to the subjective side of experience, space tends to be thought of as a part of nature or environment and thus only objectified. It was primarily this observation that prompted Watsuji to write Fudo, or Climate and Culture.
Lucy?
Yes?
Excuse me, could you read a little slower?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Am I going too fast? Okay. Yes. So Watsuji links the spatiality of human being to our immersion in a natural environment. In order to address what he found to be lacking in Heidegger's account of Dasein, Dilworth explains that Watsuji emphasized existential spatiality and climate as equiprimordial dimensions of human existence. In Climate and Culture, Watsuji sought to show how human spatiality shapes the intentionality of our perceptions and actions, and how climatic zones shape the character of interhuman relations and give rise to distinct cultures. Though Watsuji's anthropological views are riddled with complications, the way his theory of climate integrates the natural environment into the phenomenology of lived experience is highly valuable and has inspired significant contributions to comparative environmental philosophy. For example, James McCrae joins Watsuji's dialectic of individuals within their climatic milieu to discussions of ecology, sustainability, and geopolitical security. He builds on Watsuji's double negation of the singularity of individuals and their cohesion within a social totality. The structure of Ningen holds the I of the individual in tension with the we of collective society. The individuality of the I is never eliminated, but one can know oneself only through one's relation to a greater whole of which one is part. On the other hand, the we of the social cannot exist without the individuals that comprise it, but the we is not simply an aggregate of persons like marbles in a jar. The betweenness of human experience implies that both poles of Ningen, the I and we, are negated such that our experience is always a layering of one's private subjectivity and the public space of our shared life, Seiken. Of course, this space of the life world is characterized by Fudo. Therefore, McCrae describes the triangulation of the individual, the social collective, and the environment as a triple negation. He writes, while the ethics of Ningen is created by the double negation of the individual human and the collective environmental ethics is created by a process of triple negation in which the individual and society both negate themselves in relation to the natural environment. The good of the individual and the good of human society must be balanced with the good of the environment because these goods are all ultimately interdependent. McCrae goes on to argue that the notion of kyosei, or mutualism within ecology, is the paradigm through which this balance can occur. McCrae's discussion of triple negation is helpful because it places the environment into the network of relationality as differentiated from other human beings. Furo is both social and physical environment, neither of which can be separated from the existential space of lived experience. Together, the Heidegger of triple negation is the place, basho, or field of social ecological life. McCrae concludes that the goods of individuals, communities, and natural environments are promoted only through the harmonious interrelation of kyosei, which means that we must view other human beings and the natural world as stakeholders in the common good rather than as raw material for the satisfaction of self-interest. This conclusion is highly sensible, but we are left with the problem of how to enact the kind of ethical mutualism for which McCrae calls. I will return to this point in section 2. David Johnson eloquently describes Heidegger and Fudo as the dimensions of the basic space and place in and through which the self is able to be continuous with the world. And he acknowledges the negative relationality that McCrae calls triple negation. This continuity, Johnson writes, does not mean that the self is simply reducible to that which surrounds it. Instead, this is a form of unity constituted by the very difference and distance between self, other, and Fudo. Inutsuka Yu adds to this understanding an account of the rhythmic patterns of Fudo in the spatio-temporality of human existence. She writes, "There is no place in which humans live without rhythms. These rhythms do not exist independently of human existence, but are born because of its betweenness. The environment, here there is no distinction between natural and social, is integrated within human existence, with rhythms that in turn support cooperative life. For example, the hours of the day, timing of meals, schedules of trains, city blocks, traffic patterns, etc., mark out patterns in the spatio-temporality of Heidegger. The changing seasons and kinds of labor associated with them, especially in agriculture, expand these rhythms over the course of the year, adding further texture and concreteness to the significance of Fudo." Inutsuka concludes, "This understanding provides a basis for a new anthropocentric environmental ethics, which considers the environment a part of human existence and integrates it into human ethics. It opposes non-anthropocentrism, which claims that human beings are a part of nature. It rather proposes that the environment is a part of human existence." Inutsuka's conclusion is consistent with Watsuji's identification of Fudo with human existence. However, it is questionable whether Watsuji's ethics is truly anthropocentric. Inutsuka does clarify that Watsuji's position opposes modern anthropocentrism, which takes the independent individual as its point of departure. But the location of human values within the non-duality of nature and culture in the concept of Fudo could be interpreted in different ways. The environment could be subsumed into the purview of human existence, as Inutsuka does, but the non-duality of nature and culture could also be interpreted in a way that does not privilege human values and interests. This is the position put forth by Steve Oden and Kyle Shuttleworth, whose work I will turn to now. Opposed to the modern anthropocentric value system that makes human interests its central concern, environmental philosophers such as Aldo Leopold and Arne Ness have adopted an ecocentric ethical standpoint. Ecocentrism, or ecological holism, as is sometimes called, is an ethic asserting that our primary ethical concern should be for the well-being of species, ecosystems, and other ecological wholes, rather than individual persons or organisms. Leopold was the first to articulate this view in his famous essay, The Land Ethic, originally published in 1949. The basic moral principle of Leopold's land ethic can be summarized as follows. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. The biotic community is the ecological whole in which all life is interconnected within a given horizon. This includes everything from the microorganisms in the soil and water, plants, insects, birds, and reptiles, to larger animals and humans, and it includes the larger ecological systems that constitute their interrelationships. Steve Oden makes a compelling comparison between the ethics of Watsuji and Leopold. He explains that Watsuji's ethics, based on the double structure of Ningen, does not emphasize the spatial locus of relationships between individual and individual only. Rather, he further extends his moral considerations to the relationship between the individual and nature. Oden writes, Watsuji's ethical philosophy is therefore one of the most suggestive Asian resources for environmental ethics as outlined by Aldo Leopold, in which morality is enlarged so as to include not simply individual-individual relations and individual social relations, but also the encompassing human nature relation as a major extension of practical ethics. The field of environmental ethics in North America and Europe has been a process of expanding the sphere of what types of beings are granted moral standing. Traditional liberal ethics begins with the individual moral subject, then considers the ethical nature of certain acts, their consequences, or the character of the moral agent. Over time, animal rights activists and environmentalists sought to extend moral consideration to animals and even plants. Leopold and other ecocentrists argue that, from an ecological standpoint, we must consider the well-being of the entire biotic community to promote the mutual flourishing of interdependent life. For that reason, Oden and others, such as Ariane Conti, have appealed to the Buddhist elements of Watsuji's thought and have drawn comparisons with various strands of Buddhism in support of environmental ethics. For example, the concept of engi, or dependent co-origination, and the Huayan image of Indra's net are frequently invoked to illustrate the interdependence of life within an ecosystem. Watsuji's unique approach to ethics that configures the relationality of persons within a spatial field has led his theory to be compared to other non-anthropocentric theories of environmental ethics. Kyle Shuttleworth compares Watsuji's ethics to the eco-philosophy of Arne Næss, the Norwegian philosopher considered to be the founder of the deep ecology movement. The overarching norm that guides Næss is his theory of self-realization. Shuttleworth explains that Næss envisions a large comprehensive self, as opposed to a narrow egoistic self that embraces all the life forms on the planet. This is a self which expands from each of us to include all other people, species, and nature itself. This reasoning leads Næss to introduce the notion of an ecological self to express one's continuity with the broader field of experience. The upshot of Næss's norm of self-realization is the effect it has on our relationship to the other beings with whom we are bound up in the larger matrix of life. Shuttleworth draws parallels between Næss and Watsuji by arguing that both thinkers ground their ethics within a web of relations that extends beyond those between human beings. He argues that despite Watsuji's claim that the place of ethical problems is in the betweenness of persons, we can extend his theory to further forms of life. This implies that we can interpret his ethics as characterizing the relationality between all beings, not just among human beings. He writes, we can reformulate Watsuji's ethical position to entail an ethics as the relation between being and being, not just between person and person. This is a provocative claim that warrants further analysis. It is debatable whether an ethical relation can exist between things like, for example, a shark and its prey, or trees in a forest, for Watsuji. However, it should be possible for an ethical relationship to be opened up between a human and some other non-human being. In response to this notion, Bruce Jans brings Watsuji's ethics into dialogue with the work of Martin Buber, who famously describes our ability to encounter a tree as a thou. Jans writes, the idea of in-betweenness is explicitly shown through interpersonal relationships. But as with Martin Buber, it is possible to see a mode of betweenness that exists between person and non-person. In a sense, Fudo is the context of ethical action, the web of relations and emergent properties that exists when we focus on relation rather than discrete elements of a system. In part 3 of Runrigaku, where Watsuji discusses the ethical implications of the spatiality of Ningen, he states that, Quote, "The natural environment, consisting of such things as mountains and rivers, grass and trees, possess a thou characteristic in its primitive features," end quote. Thus, it seems possible for the ethical relation of Heideggerian to exist between humans and natural entities. However, Jans also claims that Watsuji's ethics is a resolutely human-focused approach, and so it is doubtful that an ethical relation could exist between non-human beings, at least from Watsuji's perspective. However, that does not necessarily foreclose individuals and society as a whole from attending to non-human entities as thous and cultivating an ethical stance towards them. From an ecocentric standpoint, our ethical concern should be for greater ecological wholes, not just individual plants and animals. This may be where the relevance of Watsuji's philosophy for contemporary environmental ethics can be found. His account of the relationality of betweenness and his inclusion of the ecological dimensions of human existence in his concept of Fudo enlarges the scope of ethics in ways that could be leveraged to support greater environmental consciousness. According to Jans, Watsuji's concept of climate is really a kind of ethics of place. This resonates with Johnson's view that Watsuji's philosophy can be seen as a form of topological thinking that introduces an integrative analysis that approaches phenomenon in terms of encompassing conditions, structures, and wholes within which they are emplaced. Reflecting on the various ways Watsuji's non-dualism can be interpreted, we can see that the life world of human beings must be understood holistically as a matrix of interrelationships that includes the natural world. Odin and Shuttleworth interpret this holism as consistent with different types of ecocentric environmental ethics. This interpretation suggests that ethical relationships can exist between human and non-human beings. Inutsuka's claim that Watsuji offers a new anthropocentrism in which the environment is part of human existence could be consistent with this view, since ethical relations still revolve around the Airagara of Ningen Sonzei. However, Inutsuka's position contrasts with Shuttleworth's claim that we can reformulate Watsuji's position to express an ethical relation between non-human beings. I believe it is accurate that human beings are central to Watsuji's ethics, but there are resources in his thought for extending ethical relations to include those between humans and other types of beings. The notion of kyosei, or ecological mutualism, is helpful for articulating what this kind of relation would entail. Despite the centrality of human beings in Watsuji's ethics, I think it makes more sense to classify his approach as a unique type of ecocentrism because Fudo encompasses the totality of place. Thus, I believe his ethics, with respect to environmental concerns, is best described as a kind of ecological holism in which human beings have an ethical relation to all beings with whom that place is shared. This interpretation is consistent with the topological self and ethics of place described by Johnson and Jans, though Jans's discussion of the implications of Watsuji's thought for environmental ethics goes further. According to him, Watsuji's philosophy is an important resource for thinking about the existential threat posed by climate change. He writes, "The central question that Watsuji gives us access to is this. Given that climate change is the change of milieus, and given that milieus are necessary for differentiated human cultural development, what happens to cultures and to thought if all climates undergo radical and sudden change?" This is a question of utmost gravity. Adapting to and mitigating the effects of climate change is an urgent task with which all cultures must be concerned. Jans is correct to conclude that Watsuji teaches us that a change in climate will require a change in culture. Similar to Jans, Steve Bynes emphasizes climate change as a threat to our very being in the world. Because climate change portends change for every climate, it entails change for every culture. It fundamentally alters who we are. It forces cultures to change or die out, and that itself is a change to our very being. The failure of many modern cultures to recognize their total dependence on the natural world has led to the exploitation of nature as a bank of resources to be extracted. As Heidegger was correct to point out, in the modern era, nature is treated as a mere standing reserve, Bestand. Bein writes, when Ningen disregards its relation to Fudo and behaves as if its lived world is external to itself and therefore irrelevant, Ningen and Fudo slip into destructive tension. This, fueled by a series of technological and economic developments, has resulted in climate change. It is true that the entwinement of climate and culture can exist either as a creative tension that generates modes of life or a destructive tension that destroys them. Watsuji helps us understand how influential and foundational natural systems are for our cultural ways of life. And yet, not only does Fudo shape us, we shape Fudo. This is where our ethical responsibility comes in. If Watsuji is correct, Bein writes, then climate change necessitates cultural change, and cultural change necessitates individual change. It is daunting to think about a global problem such as climate change, knowing that addressing it will require systemic changes in cultures around the world. Indeed, no amount of individual effort will be enough to stem the tide. It will take collective effort, which involves a multitude of individuals working together towards common goals. Watsuji's double negation of individuals in relation to the social whole denotes both our collective and individual responsibility. Jans claims that even in Rinmigaku, Watsuji is less interested in providing a meta-ethics than he is in providing a framework for understanding how to orient oneself in such a way as to lead to virtue. We have both a collective and an individual responsibility to change our cultures to prevent further environmental destruction and safeguard beings with whom we share our life world. In the next section, I will argue that honing one's ability to be responsive to others, including the ecological components of Fudo, can be characterized as the cultivation of virtue from the standpoint of environmental ethics. Okay, section 2. In the previous section, I discussed how various scholars have interpreted Watsuji's ethics and philosophy of Fudo within the framework of contemporary environmental ethics. There is an overarching agreement that together his emphasis on the betweenness of human being and the inseparability of climate and culture expands the circle of ethical concern to include non-humans and the ecological systems underpinning the places of our shared life. As mentioned above, McRae argues that Watsuji's triple negation of individuals, communities, and natural environments implies that the good of each can be achieved through the harmonious interrelation of kyosei, or symbiosis. But the question remains as to how we can enact this kind of ethical mutualism. I believe there are resources in Watsuji's discussion of aesthetics to help answer this question. Kyosei literally refers to different species living together for extended periods of time. McRae points out that Abe Hiroshi, who helped to pioneer the application of this concept to environmental ethics, described kyosei as a relationship that is mutually beneficial to both participants. A well-known example of this mutualism in ecology is that between clownfish and sea anemone. One could argue that if we translated this kind of mutualism into ethics, it would resemble Watsuji's idea of social solidarity and trust. In this type of relationship, the partners must be open and responsive to one another. There must be a reciprocity between them. We can find a description of this kind of relation in Watsuji's discussion of various traditional Japanese arts, such as gardening, tea ceremony, and renga, a traditional form of linked verse poetry composed by multiple authors. Watsuji explains that in renga, there is a bond between one person and another. A renga comes into being organically when there is a concrete realization of a dialectical unity between the individual person and the body of poetry composers. This being so, if there happens to be a self-centered person in the group, a certain distortion will be felt and the spirit of the group will not be elevated. However, when someone lacks individuality and is only influenced by the suggestions of others, a certain lack of power will be experienced and the creative enthusiasm will not come into being. From this, it is clear that there must be a balance or attunement among the group in which all participants harmonize. This involves a subtle level of receptivity where each person feels along with and responds to others. A similar sort of dynamic takes place in the art of tea ceremony. Attunement to others in the performance of tea ceremony and renga may be extended to the non-human components involved in other types of arts, such as garden design. Watsuji describes how an artist must have a keen aesthetic sensibility to create harmony when designing a garden. The balance among the rocks and plants is not simply a matter of geometric proportion, he claims, but rather an accord of spirit. Just as there can be an accord between two human beings, so we can see a similar kind of relatedness between a garden's rocks and its moss, or even between one rock and another. Watsuji's reference to the spirits of rocks and other elements of nature is not idiosyncratic. It reflects an attitude that has long been a part of East Asian Buddhisms. Graham Parks explains that the phrase "following the request of the rock" is used frequently in a manual on garden design from the 11th century to encourage a responsiveness on the part of the garden maker to what we might call the soul of the stone. Rather than imposing a preconceived design on the site and the elements there, the accomplished garden maker will be sensitive to what the particular rocks want. This insight connects back to the point made earlier about our ability to enter into an ethical relationship with non-human beings. Watsuji's discussion of harmonizing the relations of stones and plants in a garden suggests that it is possible to be receptive and responsive to various kinds of natural entities, as well as the broader fudo. One could go so far to say that there can be kyosei in ethical and aesthetic relations, in addition to those in ecology. At the heart of this discussion is a comportment of receptivity and responsiveness. To embody these traits is to express the virtue of reciprocity, whereby all the elements of one's betweenness are brought into balance. This mode of relation may be practiced among humans and the ecological elements of their climatic milieu. Moreover, recognizing the extent to which one's own self is constituted by its relationships to others and its natural surroundings provides an opportunity to cultivate deeper, more ethically attuned relationships. Johnson expresses something to this effect when he writes that who one is engulfed by and emerges as an expression of fudo. If I can come to see this clearly, he writes, I can perhaps more fully identify with and feel the imperative to care for the local natural environment in which I have my very being. Aaron McCarthy and Lina Droz have highlighted parallels between Watsuji's relational ethics and feminist ethics of care, and both scholars cite ecofeminist Val Plumwood, whose work offers a powerful critique of hierarchical dualisms that harm both women and nature. According to McCarthy, Droz, and Johnson, extending the relationality of Heidegger to include our climatic milieu should compel us to adopt an attitude of care and reciprocity towards one another and the social ecological places where we are immersed. In order to address large-scale environmental problems like climate change and biodiversity loss, we must scale up our ability to harmonize relations between our social structures and the natural systems on which they depend. Receptivity to ecological wholes, such as ecosystems, must be practiced by entire communities and reflected in the kinds of artifacts and infrastructure that we build. In other words, we need a culture of social ecological care. Only then will the full potential of Watsuji's ethics as an expression of place be realized. Shuttleworth and I have pointed to Satoyama landscapes as ecologically sound examples of the integration of nature and culture. Shuttleworth discusses the village of Hari in Shiga Prefecture, where there is a symbiotic relationship between humans, animals, plants, and the earth, all mediated by water. Hari is known for its use of kabata, connected spring water streams within homes that are used to wash dishes and rinse vegetables. These streams are home to several koi that eat the food scraps. The water of the kataba is part of the flow of the larger watershed, which flows throughout the homes in the village. Given the shared nature of the water, a high degree of trust must exist among the community to keep the water clean and usable for everyone. Therefore, I agree with Shuttleworth that the relationship of Kyosei exhibited by Hari is a perfect model of Watsujian environmental ethics in practice. The unique social ecological infrastructure and patterns of Fudo in Hari cannot be easily replicated in other places. The riverside method of accessing water in Hari developed out of the particular Fudo of their locale. Life in a different climatic milieu will give rise to different interrelations between people, water, animals, land, etc., that will reflect the opportunities and limitations of those places. Our task is to be attentive to the rhythms of Fudo and respond in ways that cultivate mutualism in our encounters with others and the natural elements therein. The first step in cultivating ethical relationships that include the larger matrix of life is to overcome the dualism between matter and spirit that has divided human beings from the rest of the natural world. We must comprehend ourselves as plain members of the biotic community, as Leopold said. More than that, we must comprehend ourselves to be in ontological solidarity with the earth and its myriad creatures. Augustin Burke argues that prior to modernity, traditional societies were able to integrate their representations of nature and their moral rules within their conception of the cosmos. We moderns, he writes, lost that ability when things turned into morally neutral objects for us, ontologically distinct from us as moral subjects. Burke claims that the dualism that divorces human beings from the natural order brought about what Heidegger denounced as a loss of world or de-worldling. Nevertheless, Burke continues, Heidegger did not follow the logic of Dasein through to the end. Watsuji picks up where Heidegger left off. Burke praises Watsuji for going beyond the aporia created by the modern dualism that restricted ethics to the realm of human life, conceived as separate from nature. This aporia arose from the fact that a being limited by the individual horizon of the Cartesian I, and even Heidegger's Dasein, cannot exercise a moral rule that requires one to take account of what is beyond that horizon, the environment, or fudo in Watsuji's vocabulary. On Watsuji's view, nature or the environment is neither outside of us nor identical to us. Using the triple negation of Ningen and Fudo as a framework, we can cultivate a mode of relationality that encourages mutualism and reciprocity. That mode of engagement with one another and our climatic milieu is desperately needed in our present historical moment. I concur with Jans's statement that the abstraction of climate change that dominates public discourse has no sensitivity to betweenness. There is no trust and no truth. There is no flow, no dynamism, and no creation of anything new and vital. The climate crisis is surely a crisis of ecosystems and species, but it is also a crisis of discourse, imagination, and place. Philosophy offers a space to develop a nuanced discourse, to create paths forward. Watsuji proves to be a highly fruitful source of inspiration for this endeavor.
Thank you, Professor Schultz. I think we have 10 or 15 minutes open discussion questions. Oh, okay. Please.
Yeah. Thank you for the service that you've done and kind of laying out the state of affairs right now with Watsuji and task of environmental ethics. Yeah, for myself, I often find myself kind of like lost in the forest a little bit. So I appreciate you giving me some orientation. Yeah, now that I think I have a bit of orientation, I wanted to draw a comparison and ask you on your thoughts about this. So the comparison I want to draw is with the problem that Hegel was trying to deal with at his time. The issue he was trying to deal with was this concern about the developing, civil society, this, this sort of middle class exchange of desire, right? And this concern that individuals will not see themselves as being part of some larger project. So, of course, famously, he has these ideas about the ethical substance, these places where, individuals are able to kind of find themselves within a broader project, nation state, and the nation state itself being placed within a broader history. Now, one of the challenges we saw after Hegel's death was that this very conception of the nation state, in a way, kind of failed to conceive of itself as, an equal global community, right? Instead, we saw growing imperialism, an explosion of new capitalist markets, and so on and so forth. And so, in a way, kind of Hegel's gamble that individuals would be able to see themselves as part of this broader ethical project. For him, freedom and self-determination, in a way, sort of failed after he died. So the parallel I want to draw here, when we bring Watsuji into this discussion, I'm not a specialist in Watsuji, but as far as I see, this conception of Fudo is a concern in a certain way with particularity, right? And so I think one of the challenges to this understanding history in this temporal line doesn't really allow for the specificity of, different branches of historical change. And so Fudo is one way to look at the way that different societies can have their own, you might say, path dependence in their historical development, and by being rooted in specific places. Right? But now, after Watsuji's death, in a similar way, we're faced with a kind of unprecedented new challenge, where as a global community, we have this global climate crisis, which in a way kind of uproots us in a certain sense from our particularity, from our specificity, and forces us to now think, as you say, to have some care for these wholes, these new ecological wholes, to try to see our own specificity and particularity as now part of some greater ecological whole.
All right, what was your question?
Yes. So the question is now, we saw then that with Hegel, there was this kind of a failure for individual states to see themselves as part of a whole. And now I think you've pointed out that here we also have a failure to see ourselves as part of a global ecological whole. And so I'm wondering then, does Watsuji have the resources for responding to this kind of crisis, which he himself did not actually experience, and which he himself did not have a chance to theorize? You see, it's two different issues, this finding ourselves at home in a particular Fudo versus seeing ourselves in a global ecological whole, right? And actually caring for this global ecological whole.
I think that it doesn't make sense to think about a global Fudo. I think that it has to be more localized in terms of concrete relationships, and in a literal, like, shared space. So I think more at a community level, in a town or even a region, where there is a kind of shared identity of people in their relationship to their land and the sort of rhythms of life that they experience together. I think that that's the place to start to kind of heal the alienation that we feel. I think, in some ways, the way that we have this virtual communication, I'm in Tennessee and you're in Japan, and we're communicating in live time, it makes it seem like there could be a kind of global community. But I think that that is not the effective way to kind of carry out the kind of ecological care that I'm describing, that I think Watsuji gives us resources for. I think that it really does involve a personal cultivation of responsiveness to one's own milieu. And then if that can be practiced on scale, then, we can make progress. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess maybe I could have made my question much simpler if I asked about that scaling process. Is it just a matter of more people caring about their own particular communities will have the effect that the globe itself will be cared for? Or is there a
Yes,
conceptual?
I think that it has to be a local adaptation, like in terms of the issue of climate change. Like we have to start adapting to the fact that, in some places there's going to be more drought and in some places there's going to be more water, storms. And so it really has to be a kind of like attention to one's local infrastructure and social networks and, flora and fauna and so forth. And each community and region is going to need to do that in its own way because each has its own fudo.
Mhm. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Steve,
Alice, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. It's good to see you again. I want to pick up on this though. If the way our economies and also the ecology is showing us is the whole thing is interrelated. And if people are only working locally, I'll make very, very good decisions for my local ecological and economic environment, but they might be catastrophic for people downstream or for the ecology downstream. So people who are on the other side, and I think I'm wondering this idea of scaling. I mean, you speak. You really perked my interest on when you said all cultures must be concerned. And at that point, I wrote this down and I thought, you mean all social, political culture, worlds like need to be concerned. But then if you want to change the politics, you need to change the culture. If you want to change the culture, you need to change the individuals. You're speaking about that individual change, which in a beautiful way. But doesn't that have to then resonate up and transform a sort of global cultural image that I don't have to worry about just my own backyard, my own stream. I have to worry about the community that is literally, I can only see through the Zoom. If we don't do that, are we ever going to really get traction? I guess I want to challenge this idea of maintaining local and not having cultures think globally.
Yeah, I wish that could be the case. Yeah, the news right now is looking pretty bad. So I think that ideally, if we could have that receptivity and responsiveness, more on a, international level in terms of our political discourse, I think that would be ideal. I'm not going to hold out for that. So I believe that we must be more focused locally. But, I think what you're speaking of is like we can form relations, over distance. It doesn't necessarily just have to be in one's like immediate sphere, but those relationships must be forged by individuals. And so, we can have a global network of betweenness, but there's still going to be those individual nodes, right, who are sort of keeping it together. But I think that the real care, it needs to be with those in our immediate sphere, in terms of just the kind of receptivity to one's fudo in the sort of schema or framework that I'm applying here.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much for your very rich, abundant talk, from which I have learned much, very, very much things to consider further. And I thank you also because your talk presentation and have taught me how many ways we have to situate and reinterpret what this idea of Fudo or other ideas in the context of the contemporary environmental ethics. Thank you so much. And my question is, I have one question. I have one question, and let me begin by explaining the background of my question. According to in my view, we can when we talk about issues concerning environmental ethics or other ethics, we can distinguish two levels or dimensions of the discussion. One level is can be expressed, for example, can be expressed by the question, how should we humans act morally? So what is morally right actions? What is our attitude towards others and non-human beings, which can be regarded as morally good actions. This is a first level, but I believe that there is the second level, which is deeper than the first one. And this second level of the discussion is can be expressed by the following question. How can we ground, theoretically or philosophically ground some attitude, a certain attitude on the first level? So why be moral? This is the second level. So morally claims on the first level and justification of the moral crime on the second level. This is what I have in mind. This distinction between these two levels is what I have in mind. And going back to Watsuji's ethics, I personally believe that Watsuji is very anthropocentric on the second level, on the level of grounding. So how to treat non-human beings in the context of environmental ethics. Why? Because as you know, or as you know much better than me, Watsuji thinks of the notion of Fudo as the expression in Japanese hyogen, as the expression of ningen as a human existence. According to Watsuji's idea, ningen, human beings, are thoroughly, completely subjective. And in this sense, we cannot objectify human beings. So we cannot catch or grasp human beings as objects, but we should understand human beings as something subjective. And in order to understand human beings as subjects, Watsuji introduced the notion of hyogen. So human beings, ningen, can understand themselves only through only through the mediation of the Hyogen, their Hyogen, and which by which Watsuji means Fudo. And if this is the case, Fudo or environment, so to speak, is regarded as, according to Watsuji, regarded as something subjective, or more precisely, some expressions of Hyogen of human beings or Ningen. And if this is so, I think on the second level, so on the level of grounding, theoretical grounding, Watsuji completely stands on the standpoint of subjectivity, in the sense of that environment or Fudo can only be regarded or should only be regarded as human's expression. And
Can I ask a follow-up,
Please,
or
please,
sorry,
yeah.
you have something more? I just wonder then, when it comes to the imposition of like something like a natural disaster, right? So even if Fudo is something that is subjective and thoroughly, constituted by human experience, what happens when we have like climate change? I mean, it seems like there has to be some sort of realism or materialism of the environment as something that, we are impacted by, that then is a part of our subjectivity, but is not simply a human expression, right? Does that help to address or to answer to some of the issue that you were raising?
So what I would like to say is only this. I was wondering whether some scholars argument is that we can connect Watsuji's ideas on Fudo to, for example, Aldo Leopold's land ethics, according to which non-human beings has, so to speak, immanent or inherent values of their own existence. Of course, only as far as they are a part or a member of ecosystems, of course. And so I think on the second level, we can or we should more consider whether Watsuji's ethics is applicable or fruitfully applicable to other discussions or contemporary discussions concerning environmental ethics. This is only things that I want to say.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Do we have time for Ohashi Sensei? Thank you.
Sorry.
Before Ohashi, I think is Ricardo Andrade and then Ohashi Sensei.
If I can have a time. My question is quite short. I'm
Okay. Please.
I am now looking at a picture behind you, and that must be a Chinese painting of a landscape painting. And you have also talked about tea ceremony, garden, and Satoyama. And Sado, I would like to ask how you think about the so-called spiritual background, the landscape, tea ceremony and garden, Japanese garden, has a spiritual background of Zen Buddhism, and landscape painting in China has a Taoistic background. And Satoyama, that is a question, but at any rate, ecology, eco comes from Greek word, oikos, house, harmony, harmonical relation. And harmonical relation in social sense, that is okay. And Abe-san has talked about a moral dimension and also the philosophical dimension of grounding and so forth. Every model of ecosystem has a certain spiritual background. And you have not talked much about this. So if you talk short about your understanding of a spiritual or philosophical background of every image, every model of ecosystem, I will be thankful for your contribution.
Thank you. I love the question. I am not confident about an answer, but I will say that I think that where I would go is to look at embodied practice and for example, with Zen and the kind of receptivity and responsiveness to one's surrounding is really something that must be cultivated. It is a spiritual practice on a level, and that is a kind of spiritual practice that is finds its different modes in art of various kinds, such as gardening and painting and tea ceremony and all of those things. And insofar as we can connect more deeply with ecosystems and the larger web of relations we're a part, that is something that is a spiritual practice, if that is helpful.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, the last one, Ricardo Andrade, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Schultz. My question is very specific. Do you think that an association can be established between the social metabolism and metabolic fracture outlined by Marx and contemporary eco-Marxists such as Kohei Saito and Bellamy Foster and Watsuji, especially as it relates to the Heidegger and Ningen concept and the environmental crisis? Thank you.
That's perfect. Actually, I just gave a paper at the American Philosophical Association about Kohei Saito and the metabolic rift in relationship to agriculture and farming. Actually, I talk about Fukuoka, and who was the original Japanese natural farmer. And so I do think that he talks about Buddhist farming, a do-nothing farming. And so I think that, that kind of attention to the landscape and to the rhythms of nature and the Fudo can help us to basically form patterns of our own behavior that are integrated, in this kind of symbiosis of Kyosei. And I think that that will mend the metabolic rift if it is done so by communities on a larger scale, especially something as simple as composting, So yes, absolutely, that is very on target with what I'm thinking. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Schultz, for your
Thank you for having me. Thank you.